There's a young man standing at a crossroads tonight, somewhere in a small room with a single lamp burning. And he does not know yet that the next 10 years of his life will be decided not by luck, not by connections, not by where he was born, but by a handful of choices he is about to make without even realizing their weight. Maybe that young man is someone you know. Maybe, in some quiet corner of your own memory, that young man was you. Albert J. Beveridge wrote about him more than a century ago, and yet his words land today as if they were written for this exact moment, for this exact uncertainty so many people feel when they look at the world and wonder if they have what it takes to matter in it. This is not a story about luck. It is a story about the raw material every person carries inside them, and what happens when that material is shaped with patience, courage, and an unshakable sense of purpose. Beveridge was not a dreamer scribbling in isolation. He was a man who had lived in the arena, a senator, a public figure who had watched young men rise and young men crumble, and he wanted to leave behind something more lasting than a speech or a policy. He wanted to leave behind a kind of map, not for the rare genius or the inherited fortune, but for the ordinary young man with ordinary beginnings who still burned, quietly, with the desire to become someone. That desire is the real subject of this book, and it is the real subject of this story tonight, because that desire has not gone extinct in 100 years. It has simply been waiting for someone to speak to it directly, without flattery, without empty encouragement, and without pretending that the world owes anyone anything. Picture a young man leaving home for the first time. Maybe he is heading to a city he has only read about, carrying a suitcase that feels heavier with every step away from his front door. He has dreams, of course he does. But dreams in his chest feel different from dreams spoken out loud. Out loud they sound fragile, almost embarrassing, like a child's drawing held up to a room full of skeptical adults. Beveridge understood this fragile moment better than almost any writer of his time, because he had been that young man once, full of intention and short on proof. And so he begins not with grand abstractions, but with something startlingly practical, the idea that the world does not care about your dreams until you have done something with them. That sentence might sting a little, and it should, because comfort is not what changes a life. Clarity is what changes a life, and clarity sometimes arrives wearing the face of discomfort. There's a kind of mercy hidden inside that sting, though, because once a young person accepts that the world is indifferent to mere wishing, they are freed from waiting for permission. They stop looking for someone to tap them on the shoulder and say, "You are ready now, go." Beveridge insisted that readiness is not granted. It is built, brick by brick, through habits so small they often go unnoticed by the person building them. Imagine a young apprentice in a small workshop, sweeping floors and cleaning tools, convinced that real opportunity is happening elsewhere, in some grander office, under some more impressive title. And yet, without realizing it, he is learning patience. He is learning precision. He is learning to do small things without complaint, which, as it turns out, is the secret training ground for every person who ever did something large. This is where the heart of the book begins to beat strongly, in the insistence that character is not a decoration added after success, but the very engine that produces it. Beveridge was relentless on this point, almost stubborn, because he had seen so many young men with talent burn brightly and then disappear, undone not by lack of ability, but by lack of discipline, lack of restraint, lack of the quiet inner strength that keeps a person steady when no one is watching. Talent in his eyes was almost cheap, abundant even, scattered across every generation in surprising quantities. What was rare, what was nearly priceless, was the will to keep showing up, day after unglamorous day, refining a craft long after the applause has faded or before it has even arrived. Think of two young men starting at the same company on the same morning. One is naturally clever, quick with words, quick with ideas, the kind of person who seems destined for something remarkable. The other is slower, more careful, less flashy in conversation, but stubbornly consistent in effort. 10 years later, it is so often the second young man who has risen the furthest, not because brilliance doesn't matter, but because brilliance without discipline tends to scatter itself across 100 unfinished beginnings. Beveridge would have nodded at this story, because he wrote, in his own way, that ambition without character is like a powerful engine with no steering wheel, capable of incredible speed and entirely incapable of reaching any meaningful destination. And here the story takes an interesting turn, because Beveridge does not simply scold ambition, he honors it. He believed deeply that a young man without ambition is a kind of tragedy, a flame extinguished before it ever had the chance to warm a room. Ambition, properly understood, was not vanity. It was not the hunger for applause or wealth for its own sake. It was something closer to a compass, a felt sense that one's life could mean something beyond mere survival, that there was work to be done in the world worth doing well. He wanted young men to feel that hunger without shame, to stop apologizing for wanting more than a quiet, unremarkable existence, because that hunger, rightly aimed, was the very thing that built nations, cured diseases, and lifted families out of generations of hardship. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with ambition, though, and Beveridge does not shy away from naming it. The young man who wants something more than what is comfortable will often find himself misunderstood by the very people closest to him. Friends who are content with smaller horizons may mistake his drive for arrogance. Family members who fear change may mistake his vision for foolishness. This is one of the quieter tragedies tucked inside the book. The recognition that growth often requires walking ahead of the people you love, not out of disrespect, but simply because growth, by its nature, moves. Beveridge offers no easy comfort here, only the steady reassurance that this loneliness, while real, is not permanent, and that the people who truly love you will eventually either grow alongside you or celebrate you from wherever they remain standing. If you're finding something in these words that feels personal, something that echoes a private struggle you haven't said out loud to many people, that's exactly the kind of connection this story is meant to create. And if you're enjoying this audiobook, please like and subscribe to Audiobook Library. It helps the channel grow and allows more timeless books like this one to reach more people who need exactly this kind of voice in their ear tonight. Now let's step further into the world Beveridge is building, because the next idea he explores is one that modern readers often resist at first, and then embrace with surprising relief. He argues that education, real education, is not something that ends when school ends. In fact, he treats formal schooling almost like the laying of a foundation, necessary but nowhere near sufficient. The real education, the one that shapes a man's entire future, happens after the diploma is framed and forgotten on a wall somewhere. It happens in libraries visited quietly after work. It happens in long train rides spent reading instead of staring blankly out the window. It happens in conversations sought out deliberately with people who know more than you do, even when those conversations are uncomfortable, even when they reveal exactly how much you still don't know. There's a particular image worth sitting with here, that of a young man returning home exhausted after a full day of labor, his hands rough, his back sore, and yet choosing, almost stubbornly, to read for one more hour before sleep takes him. No one applauds this. No one sees it. There is no audience for that hour of effort except the young man himself, and whatever future version of him is being quietly assembled in the dark. Beveridge wanted his readers to understand that this invisible hour, repeated across months and years, becomes the very foundation upon which an entire life of influence and capability is built. The world rewards visible results, yes, but those visible results are almost always the offspring of invisible discipline. It's worth pausing here to notice something Beveridge never says outright but clearly believes, that most people overestimate the importance of a single dramatic moment and underestimate the importance of 1,000 small ones. We love stories of overnight success because they are exciting, easy to tell, easy to romanticize. But Beveridge, ever the realist, peels back that myth gently, almost like pulling back a curtain to reveal the machinery behind a magic trick. The young lawyer who delivers a brilliant closing argument that wins him sudden fame did not discover that brilliance the morning of the trial. He built it, sentence by sentence, case by case, failure by failure, in rooms no one was watching, for years before that single shining moment arrived. This reframing matters more than it might seem at first, because it changes how a person treats their own daily life. If greatness is mostly built in private, unglamorous hours, then today, this very ordinary day becomes meaningful again. The unremarkable Tuesday spent studying a difficult subject. The quiet morning spent practicing a skill no one has noticed yet. These are not wasted hours waiting for a future that may or may not arrive. They are the future itself, already being constructed, one invisible brick at a time. I wanted young men to feel the dignity in that, to stop measuring their worth only by visible results, and start measuring it by the consistency of effort poured into hours nobody else will ever know about. And here, almost as if anticipating a young reader's skepticism, Beveridge turns to address something deeply human, the fear of being ordinary. There's a particular kind of dread that settles over a young person who looks around and realizes that talent is everywhere, that the world is filled with bright, capable people, and that nothing about birth or circumstance guarantees they will rise above the crowd. Beveridge does not pretend this fear is irrational. Instead, he offers something more useful than false comfort. He offers a redefinition. He suggests that what separates an ordinary life from an extraordinary one is rarely a difference in raw material. It is almost always a difference in sustained intention. The young man who decides clearly and repeatedly what kind of person he intends to become, and who organizes his daily choices around that decision, will almost inevitably outpace the young man who simply drifts, however gifted that drifting young man might naturally be. There's something quietly liberating in that idea, because it removes the excuse of comparison. You do not have to be the most naturally talented person in the room. You only have to be the most consistently intentional one. Beveridge tells, in his own way, the story of countless men history barely remembers by name, who simply refused to stop improving, who treated every defeat as data rather than verdict, who kept their eyes fixed not on where they currently stood compared to others, but on where they stood compared to who they were a year earlier. This single shift in comparison, from outward to inward, quietly dismantles the paralyzing fear of being ordinary, because progress, real personal progress, is available to absolutely everyone willing to pursue it honestly. Of course, none of this matters without courage, and Beveridge spends considerable energy on this particular virtue, because courage, in his understanding, is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act rightly in spite of it. He paints a picture of young men facing decisions that terrify them, speaking in public for the first time, confronting a corrupt superior, standing alone against popular opinion because their conscience demands it. None of these moments feel heroic while they're happening. They feel uncomfortable, uncertain, even nauseating in the moment. And yet Beveridge insists, almost like a mentor leaning close and speaking with quiet intensity, that this exact discomfort is the price of admission into a meaningful life. Anyone who avoids all discomfort avoids by definition all growth, because growth and comfort cannot occupy the same room for very long. Let's slow down here, because this idea deserves more than a passing mention. Think about a young clerk working in a government office, watching a more senior official quietly mishandle public funds, saying nothing would be easy, safe, even rewarded in the short term by a superior's approval. Speaking up risks everything: his job, his reputation, his immediate comfort. Beveridge believed this exact kind of moment, small in scale but enormous in consequence, is where character is truly tested and truly built. Not in grand wartime heroics most people will never face, but in these quiet, almost invisible decisions that occur in offices and homes and street corners, decisions nobody else will ever know about unless the young man chooses to speak of them, which notably, the truly courageous rarely do. There's something deeply moving about this version of courage, because it democratizes heroism. You do not need a battlefield to become brave. You need only an ordinary Tuesday and an uncomfortable truth that needs saying. Beveridge wanted his readers to understand that every single day offers these small forks in the road, moments where the easy path and the right path diverge slightly, almost imperceptibly, and that a life of integrity is simply the accumulated result of choosing the slightly harder path often enough that it becomes habit rather than struggle. From here, the book moves into something Beveridge clearly considered essential, though it might surprise modern readers expecting only talk of ambition and discipline. He writes at length about the importance of physical vitality, of guarding one's health and energy as carefully as one guards one's reputation. This was not vanity or obsession with appearance. It was practical wisdom rooted in observation. Beveridge had watched brilliant young men burn out early, undone not by lack of intelligence, but by neglected bodies that simply could not sustain the demands their ambitions placed upon them. He writes almost like a concerned older brother here, urging young readers to walk, to breathe fresh air, to sleep properly, to treat the body not as a tool to be exploited without limit, but as the very vessel through which every other ambition must travel. There's a kind of humility tucked into this advice that's easy to miss on a first reading. Beveridge is essentially saying that no amount of brilliance, no amount of ambition, no amount of carefully cultivated character can outrun a body that has been pushed past its limits without care. He tells implicitly the story of countless young men who sacrificed sleep for ambition, who treated exhaustion as a badge of honor, only to find themselves, in their 30s or 40s, paying a debt their younger selves never imagined they were accumulating. This is one of the quieter, more tender warnings in the book, offered not with judgment, but with the gentle urgency of someone who has seen this exact mistake repeated too many times to stay silent about it. And here the narrative widens further still, because Beveridge was not only interested in personal success, he was deeply interested in what a young man owes the world around him. This is perhaps the most striking turn the book takes. The insistence that personal ambition, if it stops at personal gain, eventually becomes hollow. He believed, with what feels like genuine conviction rather than polite moralizing, that the highest use of any man's developed talent was service, not in some abstract sacrificial sense, but in the very real sense of contributing something useful to the community, the nation, the people who will come after. A young man who builds wealth only for himself, Beveridge suggests, has technically succeeded but has somehow also missed the entire point of the effort. Imagine a young engineer who spends years mastering his craft, who becomes brilliant at solving complex mechanical problems, and who could quite easily spend his entire career simply enriching himself through that skill. Beveridge would not condemn the wealth itself. He was no opponent of ambition or reward, but he would gently insist that the engineer's true fulfillment, the kind that lingers and satisfies long after the money has been spent or saved, comes from the bridges that stand for 100 years, the systems that quietly improve countless unseen lives. The younger engineers he eventually mentors, who go on to build things he never could have imagined alone. Success that touches only oneself, in Beveridge's vision, eventually feels strangely empty, like a feast eaten entirely alone in a locked room, while a celebration happens audibly just outside the door. This idea of service connects directly to something else. Beveridge returns to repeatedly, the role of citizenship, of civic responsibility, of a young man's duty not just to his own household, but to the larger structure that makes his household possible in the first place. Writing as he did during a period of significant national growth and change, Beveridge wanted young men to understand that the comfortable systems they often took for granted, fair courts, functioning governments, safe communities, were not permanent fixtures of nature. They were fragile human creations, maintained only by the continued attention and participation of people willing to care about something larger than their own immediate circumstances. A young man who votes thoughtfully, who stays informed, who occasionally sacrifices personal convenience for public good, is not performing some abstract virtue. He is doing maintenance on the very structure that allows his personal ambitions to even be possible in the first place. There's a particular warmth in how Beveridge frames this responsibility, because he never makes it feel like a burden. Instead, he frames civic participation almost like an extension of personal dignity, a way for an individual to feel connected to something larger than the small, anxious orbit of his own daily concerns. Think of a young man who feels somewhat insignificant in his small town, convinced that nothing he does could possibly matter on any meaningful scale. Beveridge would gently challenge that assumption, pointing out that nations are not built by a handful of famous men, but by millions of quietly responsible citizens making small, consistent choices that, when added together across a population, become the very texture of what we call a healthy society. If this idea is landing somewhere inside you, that quiet feeling of wanting to matter beyond your own four walls, hold on to that feeling, because Beveridge is about to build on it in a way that connects everything we've discussed so far into something larger and more cohesive. There's a thread running through all of this: ambition, discipline, courage, health, service, and that thread is about to reveal itself more clearly. But first, if this story is resonating with you the way it seems to be resonating, please consider liking and subscribing to Audiobook Library, because there's still a great deal of this book left to explore, and more timeless works waiting after this one. Let's return now to that thread, because Beveridge eventually reveals what holds all of these separate ideas together, and the answer is simpler than most readers expect, though no less demanding. The thread is purpose, a clear, deliberately chosen sense of what one's life is actually for. Without purpose, ambition becomes restless and directionless, discipline becomes joyless and mechanical, courage becomes occasional and inconsistent. Even health becomes merely vanity rather than stewardship. But with purpose, every other quality Beveridge discusses suddenly organizes itself naturally, almost effortlessly, around a single unifying center. This raises an obvious and slightly intimidating question. How does a young man actually discover his purpose? Beveridge offers no magic formula here, no neat 5-step process, because he understood correctly. That purpose is rarely handed to a person fully formed. It is usually discovered gradually, often messily, through trial, through failure, through unexpected detours that initially feel like wasted time but later reveal themselves as essential preparation. He tells, in essence, the story of young men who tried one path, found it unsuitable, tried another, found that one slightly better, and slowly, through this imperfect process of elimination and adjustment, arrived at work that finally felt less like labor and more like an expression of who they actually were. There's real comfort hidden in this slow, imperfect picture of purpose, especially for anyone listening tonight who feels behind, who feels like everyone else seems to know exactly what they're doing while they themselves remain uncertain. Beveridge would say, gently but firmly, that uncertainty is not a sign of failure. It is simply an early stage of a process every meaningful life passes through. The young man who tries something, fails, adjusts, and tries again, is not behind the young man who appears confident and settled. He is simply earlier, in an honest process, while the seemingly confident young man may, in fact, be avoiding the harder work of genuine self-examination altogether. Beveridge also makes a point that feels almost rebellious for his time, and remains quietly rebellious even now: the insistence that purpose does not have to mean fame or grand public recognition. He honors, with what feels like genuine respect rather than condescension, the quiet purpose of a devoted father raising children with patience and integrity, the purpose of a skilled craftsman who simply does excellent work that others rely upon, the purpose of a teacher shaping minds in a small classroom that history will never specifically remember. Greatness, in his vision, was never strictly about scale. It was about the wholehearted devotion brought to whatever scale a person actually occupied. This matters enormously because so many young people today, much like in Beveridge's own time, quietly torture themselves with the assumption that a meaningful life must look impressive from the outside, must be photographed, must be applauded, must trend somewhere visible to strangers. Beveridge offers a quiet correction to this anxiety, suggesting instead that meaning is measured not by visibility, but by integrity of effort, the simple, profound dignity of doing one's actual work, whatever it is, as well as it can possibly be done, and doing it for reasons deeper than mere recognition. As the book moves toward its later passages, Beveridge turns his attention to something that feels almost tender coming from a man known primarily for political life, the subject of failure, and how a young man should hold it without being destroyed by it. He writes with surprising gentleness here, almost as though setting aside his role as senator and statesman to speak instead as someone who has personally tasted defeat and lived long enough afterward to understand its true shape. Failure, he insists, is never the opposite of success. It is, almost paradoxically, one of its essential ingredients, an unavoidable part of the very process that eventually produces anything worth having. Picture a young man who attempts something significant, pours real effort and real hope into it, and watches it collapse anyway, publicly, embarrassingly, in front of people whose opinion matters to him. This moment feels, in the instant it happens, like definitive proof of inadequacy, like a verdict that cannot be appealed. Beveridge gently dismantles this interpretation. He suggests that failure is rarely a verdict at all. It is simply information, often the most valuable information a person can receive, because success tends to teach very little beyond the fact that a particular approach worked once, under particular conditions, while failure reveals, with often brutal clarity, exactly which assumptions were wrong and exactly where genuine growth still needs to happen. There's something almost paternal in how Beveridge handles this topic, as though he is sitting beside a discouraged young reader, placing a steady hand on his shoulder and saying, without any trace of pity, that this particular collapse is not the end of the story unless he decides to treat it that way. He reminds his readers, repeatedly and in different ways throughout the book, that nearly every figure history eventually celebrated experienced failures along the way that felt, at the time, just as final and just as devastating as anything a young listener tonight might currently be facing. The difference, the entire difference, lay not in avoiding failure, but in refusing to let any single failure become the last chapter of an unfinished story. This naturally leads Beveridge into a discussion of patience, though not the passive, waiting kind of patience many people imagine when they hear that word. He describes something closer to active patience, a steady, deliberate persistence that continues working even when results remain invisible for uncomfortably long stretches of time. He tells of young men who work diligently for years in obscurity, doing excellent work that nobody outside their immediate circle ever noticed, and who might easily have concluded that their effort was wasted, that the world simply wasn't paying attention and never would. And yet, in story after story, that invisible effort eventually compounded into something undeniable, often suddenly, often in a way that looked from the outside like overnight success, but was, in truth, simply the visible eruption of years of underground work finally reaching the surface. This idea of compounding effort deserves a moment of real reflection, because it explains something that confuses so many ambitious young people: the strange unfairness of effort that seems to produce no results for a long, long time, followed by a relatively sudden and almost disproportionate breakthrough. Beveridge would say there is no real mystery here, only a misunderstanding of how growth actually works. Skill, reputation, and opportunity tend to build slowly, beneath the surface, largely invisible, until they reach a kind of critical mass, after which their effects become suddenly, almost dramatically visible. The young man who quits during the long invisible phase, convinced his effort is producing nothing, often quits at the exact moment he was closest to that visible breakthrough, simply because he could not yet see what was quietly accumulating beneath the surface of his daily life. There's a story-like quality to how Beveridge frames this, almost like watching a seed planted in soil. For a long time, nothing visible happens above ground, and an impatient observer might reasonably conclude that nothing is happening at all. But beneath that quiet, unremarkable surface, root systems are forming, slowly, invisibly, preparing the structural foundation that will eventually support rapid, visible growth once conditions allow it. And his young readers to trust this process even when it offered no immediate proof of itself, because demanding constant visible proof of progress is, in his estimation, one of the surest ways to abandon worthwhile work just before it finally bears fruit. As we move closer to the heart of what Beveridge is ultimately trying to leave behind in this book, he begins weaving these separate threads: ambition, discipline, courage, health, service, purpose, patience, into something resembling a complete philosophy of young manhood, though notably one that never feels rigid or formulaic. He resists giving his readers a simple checklist precisely because he understood that real life rarely cooperates with checklists. Instead, he offers something more like a set of compass directions, true regardless of the particular terrain a young man happens to find himself crossing. One of the more striking compass directions he offers involves the company a young man chooses to keep. Beveridge writes with real seriousness about the influence of friendship, insisting that the people surrounding a young man during his formative years shape him far more powerfully than he typically realizes while it's happening. He paints a picture of two young men, equally talented, equally ambitious at the outset, one of whom surrounds himself with friends who mock effort and celebrate cynicism, the other who surrounds himself with friends who take their own growth seriously and quietly expect the same from those around them. 10 years later, these two young men, despite identical starting talent, often find themselves in dramatically different positions, not primarily because of differences in ability, but because of the slow, almost invisible influence of the company each kept along the way. This particular insight feels especially relevant for anyone listening tonight who senses, perhaps uncomfortably, that certain relationships in their own life might be quietly limiting rather than expanding them. Beveridge does not suggest cruelty or abandonment of people, simply because they're not as ambitious. What he suggests, more gently, is awareness, the simple recognition that the voices a young man listens to most often will eventually become, in some real sense, the voice he uses to talk to himself. Choose those voices, he seems to say, with the same care you would choose a teacher, because, in many ways, that's exactly what a close friendship becomes over time. Beveridge also spends meaningful time on the subject of speech itself, the way a young man expresses himself, both in conversation and in more formal settings. As a man who built much of his own public life through oratory, he understood intimately how much influence flows through the simple ability to articulate one's thoughts clearly and persuasively. He encourages young readers to take their own speech seriously, not in some artificial, performative way, but through genuine attention to clarity, honesty, and the discipline of actually thinking before speaking. He tells, almost in passing, of young men whose careers advanced not primarily because they were smarter than their peers, but because they had taken the trouble to learn how to express their intelligence in ways other people could actually understand and act upon. There's something quietly democratic in this advice as well, because clear communication, unlike raw intellect, is almost entirely a learnable skill. Beveridge essentially tells his readers that they do not need to wait for some natural gift of eloquence. They only need to practice, deliberately and repeatedly, the simple disciplines of clear thought and honest expression. This advice has aged remarkably well, perhaps even better today than when it was first written, in a world absolutely saturated with communication that is fast, constant, and often careless. The young person who learns to speak and write with genuine clarity stands out today, not because clarity has become rarer in raw terms, but because it has become rarer, relative to the sheer volume of noise surrounding it. As Beveridge moves toward the closing portions of his message, something shifts subtly in his tone. The practical advice continues, but it becomes wrapped in something closer to genuine affection, almost as though he is no longer simply instructing his readers, but actively rooting for them, the way an older relative might watch a younger one walk toward a difficult but worthwhile future. He writes about the inevitable disappointments that await every ambitious life, the friends who will betray trust, the institutions that will sometimes fail to reward genuine merit, the years that will sometimes feel wasted even when they were not. He does not promise that virtue guarantees comfort, because he was far too honest a writer to make a promise life itself does not reliably keep. What he promises instead is something quieter, but in its own way more durable, the assurance that a life built on genuine character, sustained effort, and meaningful purpose will retain its worth, regardless of whether external recognition ever fully arrives. This is perhaps the most emotionally resonant idea in the entire book, the suggestion that dignity does not depend on applause. A young man who lives with integrity, who works diligently at meaningful tasks, who treats others with genuine respect, who contributes something useful to the world around him, has already succeeded in the deepest sense Beveridge cares about, regardless of whether history ever specifically remembers his name. There's a passage, almost prayer-like in its rhythm, where Beveridge seems to step entirely outside the role of practical advisor and speak instead as a kind of witness to something larger than any individual achievement. He reflects on the long chain of human effort stretching backward through history, generation after generation of young men who faced uncertainty much like the uncertainty his own readers currently face, who made their own imperfect choices, who built, however modestly, upon the foundations laid by those who came before them. Every young man currently struggling with these same questions, Beveridge suggests, is simply the latest link in that ancient chain, and his own honest effort, however small it might feel in the moment, becomes part of the inheritance, eventually passed forward to those who come after him. This perspective offers something quietly profound to anyone who has ever felt that their personal struggles were somehow uniquely isolating, as though no one before them had ever faced quite this particular blend of uncertainty and hope. Beveridge gently dismantles that isolation, reminding his readers that the specific details change across generations, but the underlying human experience, the fear of inadequacy, the hunger for meaning, the slow discovery of one's own capability through repeated effort, remains remarkably consistent across time. There is, in this realization, an odd but genuine comfort, the sense that you are not alone in this particular struggle, that countless people before you have stood exactly where you now stand, uncertain and afraid, and found their way forward anyway, not through some secret unavailable to you, but through the same patient accumulation of honest effort available to absolutely anyone willing to apply it. As the book draws toward its final reflections, Beveridge circles back, almost like returning home after a long journey to where he began, the simple but demanding idea that character is destiny. Not circumstance, not luck, not even raw talent in isolation, but the quiet daily choices a young man makes about who he intends to become and how diligently he pursues that intention, despite every obstacle the world inevitably places in his path. He does not promise an easy life to anyone who follows his counsel. He promises something better, a meaningful one, built not on the shifting sands of external validation, but on the solid ground of genuine demonstrated character. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a story like this one as it nears its end. The same stillness you might feel, sitting quietly, after a long, honest conversation with someone who genuinely wanted to see you succeed and was willing to tell you the truth, rather than what was easy to hear. Beveridge never wrote to flatter his readers. He wrote to equip them, gently but firmly, for a life that would inevitably test them in ways comfort alone could never prepare them for. And in equipping them, he offered something that has quietly outlived every other detail of his own era, the conviction that an ordinary young man, willing to discipline his ambitions, guard his character, serve something beyond himself, and persist patiently through inevitable failure can become genuinely, meaningfully extraordinary, not by accident, but by deliberate, sustained choice. If somewhere in this story you recognized a version of yourself, the uncertain young man standing at his own particular crossroads, wondering whether his effort matters, whether his quiet, unwatched hours of discipline are truly building towards something, let this be the gentle reminder that they are. Every invisible hour of effort, every uncomfortable act of courage, every choice to keep going when the results remain stubbornly hidden is already shaping the person you are quietly becoming. That shaping does not require an audience to be real, and it does not require certainty to be worthwhile. It only requires your continued patient participation in your own becoming. If this story stayed with you tonight, explore the audiobook library and discover more books waiting for you, each one carrying its own quiet wisdom, ready to meet you exactly where you are, and to walk a little further with you toward wherever you are still becoming.